Alcatraz's hidden military tunnels have finally been mapped, and one buried route led straight past the prison's own walls. Ground-penetrating radar just exposed brick chambers sealed since 1859, when the U.S. Army's three-story Citadel fortress crowned this island. In 1912, engineers built the federal cellhouse directly atop that fortress, entombing its basement, magazines, and passageways beneath the exercise yard for over a century. One surveyed corridor runs past the cellhouse footprint entirely, toward the old seawall. Could any inmate have ever found it? A team of researchers set out to answer that question without a single shovel breaking the surface. Ground-penetrating radar mapped Alcatraz's entire subsurface without any excavation, reading buried structure the way an ultrasound reads through skin, using reflected pulses to build a picture nobody could get by looking at the ground. The work was led by researchers affiliated with Binghamton University, who treated the island less like a tourist stop and more like an unread archive under everyone's feet. The survey, conducted in the fall of 2024, combined ground-penetrating radar with a magnetometer sweep, logging more than 11,000 individual scan lines across the yard and cellhouse floor over 6 working days. Alcatraz covers about 22 acres, small enough that most visitors walk it in a single afternoon and leave convinced they've seen all of it. The radar returns argue otherwise. Passages and voids thread through nearly the whole footprint of the island, far beyond the handful of buildings tour groups actually enter. One corridor-shaped anomaly stands out, not because of where it sits, but what it does. Instead of stopping where the cellhouse wall stops, like every other feature on the survey, it keeps going, extending past the building every visitor assumes is the whole story of Alcatraz. Earlier historians had pieced together fragments from old maps and soldiers' letters, but fragments are not proof. Nothing in the surviving 19th or 20th century paperwork explains why a corridor would run there, or where its far end was meant to lead. Preliminary results were shared with the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Division before any public announcement, standard practice for federal landmark sites. The paperwork reaches back further than the prison. That's where this corridor's story begins. Spanish sailors had already named the island for its birds, but it took the discovery of gold in California to make the bay worth defending. Spanish navigator Juan Manuel de Ayala charted the island in 1775, calling it La Isla de los Alcatrazes after the pelicans nesting on its cliffs. Gold turned up at Sutter's Mill in January 1848, and within 2 years, San Francisco's population jumped from roughly 1,000 residents to more than 25,000, most arriving by ship through the very strait Alcatraz overlooked. The U.S. Army began fortifying Alcatraz in 1853, years before San Francisco had grown into the city people picture today, turning a bare, wind-scoured rock into a defensive position aimed at the water. Engineers and soldiers called their creation Fortress Alcatraz, built to guard the entrance to the Golden Gate against any hostile ship, at a moment when a foreign attack on a suddenly gold-rich harbor felt like a real possibility. By 1858, the fort mounted more than 100 cannons across 11 gun batteries, enough firepower on paper to seal the entire mile-wide channel. It wasn't the only position built for that job. Fort Point rose on the San Francisco side of the strait around the same years, and together the two forts were meant to catch any ship in a crossfire. Fort Point was completed in 1861, the same year the Civil War began, and the two positions never fired a shot at an enemy vessel. Cannons lined the shoreline. Barracks, magazines, and storage rooms rose around them. The Army garrisoned the island, expanded the fortifications repeatedly, and eventually used Alcatraz to hold military prisoners as well, decades before anyone associated the island's name with federal inmates or Al Capone. The first prisoners arrived in 1861. Confederate sympathizers and, later, crew members of the privateer schooner Chapman seized before it could ever leave the bay. By 1907, the War Department made it official, designating the island the Pacific Branch, U.S. military prison. That grip held for roughly 80 years, until the island was transferred toward federal prison use in the early 1930s. 80 years is enough time to build something meant to outlast its builders, and the Army put its most serious structure at the island's summit. The Citadel, a 3-story fortified barracks, was completed in 1859 as the true heart of the fort. It was designed to garrison roughly 200 soldiers and their officers, with walls up to 5 feet thick at the base, thick enough to absorb a direct cannon strike. It wasn't simple housing. It held magazines, packed with ammunition, and cisterns stocked with fresh water, engineered so a garrison could survive a full siege without a resupply ship from the mainland. Those cisterns alone could hold an estimated 40,000 gallons, enough for a besieged garrison to hold out for weeks without a single supply boat reaching the dock. A lighthouse went up on the island around the same period, the first one built on the Pacific coast of the United States, guiding ships toward a harbor the Army was simultaneously arming against them. The lighthouse was first lit in 1854, 4 years before the Citadel above it was finished, and it was later rebuilt in 1909 to the taller tower that still stands today. Thick masonry walls, narrow defensible entrances, and firing positions angled toward the water, all built by people who expected a fight to reach their doorstep. The Citadel sat on the highest point of the island, commanding a clear view across the bay toward the Golden Gate it was built to defend. The prison's cellhouse, the building every Alcatraz tour funnels visitors through today, occupies that exact same summit, same hill, same commanding view, 2 completely different buildings separated by more than 50 years. Same summit, same view, but the builders who arrived half a century later made a choice that shaped everything found beneath the yard today. The current cellhouse was constructed between 1909 and 1912, replacing the old fort's living quarters with a modern federal prison building. The project cost roughly $250,000, a considerable sum at the time, and required barging in reinforced concrete and steel, since the island had no fresh water or construction material of its own. Army engineers didn't clear the old fort out of the way first, the way a modern demolition crew would insist on doing. They built the new cellhouse directly on top of the Citadel, burying an entire fortified barracks whole instead of tearing it down stone by stone and hauling it off the island. And everything found underground today traces back to that one shortcut. The decision was almost certainly about cost, time, and the difficulty of demolition work on an isolated island, not mystery or secrecy. Every gallon of water, every sack of cement, and every laborer had to cross the bay by boat, and burying the old fort in place saved months of extra barge trips that a full demolition would have demanded. But it meant the Citadel's basement level never actually disappeared. It became the cellhouse's own basement and utility corridor, absorbed directly into the new building's infrastructure instead of erased from the island's history. Absorbed into the infrastructure is the clean, technical way to describe it. Living inside it was not clean at all. The old Citadel basement rooms became known inside the prison as the dungeon, a row of pitch-dark cells used for solitary confinement during Alcatraz's early years as a federal penitentiary, long before the more famous strip cells of D Block took over that role. Roughly a dozen of the old fort's rooms were converted this way, and inmates could be held there for up to 19 days at a stretch under regulations in force during the prison's first years, 1934 through the late 1930s. Guards sent men down into darkness, sealed off since the fort era, delivering punishment inside walls the Army had built to survive cannon fire, not to hold one isolated inmate at a time. The dungeon sits directly beneath the modern cellhouse floor, close enough that men walking the yard above, waiting for a meal or their hour of exercise, had no way of knowing what sat under their feet. All they knew was that certain men disappeared downward for days at a stretch and came back changed by whatever waited in that old fortress basement. Guards rarely explained what the space had been before it became a punishment block. Disappearing into the dungeon for days was the closest most inmates ever came to the buried fort. Almost nobody, guards included, understood how far the old structure extended underground. The dungeon was only the visible edge of it. For decades, the full extent of the old Citadel hidden beneath the recreation yard went completely unmapped. The island earned its National Historic Landmark status in 1986, 23 years after the last prisoner left. Alcatraz is protected today as a National Historic Landmark, and that status sharply limits any excavation, so digging a trench to satisfy curiosity was never a realistic option. Even trained archaeologists working under federal permits are limited to small, carefully chosen test pits, and nobody had ever justified opening one under the landmark's most visited building. The recreation yard itself, where inmates once paced in tight circles for their hour of daylight, sits directly atop the old fortress's parade ground, the exact spot where 19th century soldiers once drilled in formation. For most of the 20th century, that overlap was closer to an educated guess pieced together from old maps than a documented, verified fact. An educated guess held up until survey teams found a way to test it without breaking a single rule protecting the landmark. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses into the earth and reads what echoes back, translating the reflections into a picture of whatever solid, hollow, or buried structure lies beneath the surface, without lifting a single paving stone. The equipment used a 400 megahertz antenna array capable of resolving structure down to roughly 4 meters, deep enough to reach the Citadel's basement level without missing anything above it. It was chosen because it required no excavation on a site where an unauthorized trench could cause real, irreversible damage to protected 19th century history. Technicians walked the ground in careful, overlapping lines, dragging equipment slowly enough to catch details most tourists would never notice they were standing on. The scans focused on 2 areas, the recreation yard above the old parade ground and the cellhouse floor above the buried Citadel. 2 locations, one continuous buried structure connecting them, and for the first time, a real chance to see how they fit together. The work read more like careful surveying than treasure hunting. Seeing how it all fit together is where the project got interesting. What the radar returned lined up with the old fortress blueprints almost perfectly. 19th century fortress records described a specific layout of rooms and connecting passages, and the scans matched it, revealing brick-lined chambers consistent with magazines and cisterns sitting exactly where the old military plans said they should be. Those records include a set of 1870s U.S. Army Corps of Engineers drawings held in the National Archives, the same drawings researchers pulled to build their comparison model. Corridor-shaped voids ran between those chambers. Consistent with the tunnels, a siege-ready fort would need to move ammunition and water without stepping into open cannon range. University teams cross-referenced each buried room against measurements from the original fortification drawings, and every measurement lined up. 19th century paperwork and 21st century radar data telling the exact same story, a validation of the historical record. And then the radar handed researchers something the record couldn't explain at all. Something the historical record couldn't explain arrived as one anomaly that broke an otherwise clean pattern. A corridor-shaped void continues past the edge of the cellhouse footprint, running toward ground the prison never had any documented use for. It extends toward the island's perimeter, past any area where inmates were ever housed or permitted to walk under guard, angling toward the old seawall instead of any known prison structure. Whoever built it clearly meant it to reach somewhere specific, not just extend into empty fill. But the established fortress blueprints don't fully account for where it goes, or why it would run that far past the fort's core buildings. Every other feature the radar found had a clean, documented match in the old 19th century records. Researchers estimate the anomaly runs at least 60 feet beyond the cellhouse foundation, based on how far the radar signal continued before losing resolution. This one didn't. A single unmatched corridor, extending toward open ground on an island with a very specific reputation, was enough to turn a careful mapping project into an open question nobody could responsibly ignore. An open question nobody could ignore, on an island that spent 30 years selling itself as the one place on Earth nobody could escape from. Alcatraz operated as a federal penitentiary from 1934 to 1963, and its reputation as escape-proof was never modesty. It was marketing, built on cold bay currents, patrol boats circling day and night, and roughly 1.25 miles of open, frigid water separating the cellhouse from the nearest shore. Guard towers watched the water around the clock, and prisoners were counted so often that a single missing body triggered an island-wide lockdown within minutes. 6 manned towers ringed the island at the peak of its operation, and the water temperature in the bay hovers around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to induce hypothermia within a couple of hours. For years, Alcatraz also barred most personal visits and mail beyond a strict monthly limit, part of a broader strategy to isolate its most difficult prisoners physically and socially. That reputation still carries one unresolved asterisk. The escape attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in June 1962 was never officially closed. And to this day, nobody has proven whether the 3 men drowned in the bay or made it to shore alive. The 3 men vanished from their cells on the night of June 11th, 1962, leaving papier-mâché head decoys behind to fool the guards during nighttime counts. It remains one of the most famous open cases in American prison history. Inmates lived directly above these buried fortress structures for decades, pacing the yard, working the shops, sleeping in cells stacked above the old parade ground, without ever knowing any of it existed beneath them. Which raises the question this entire survey was always building toward. What if just one of them had known? That question has a fairly decisive answer in the fortress's own records. Cross-checked against those 19th century plans, the corridor's age and position mark it as military construction, not anything added during the later penal era. It belongs to the Army's Alcatraz, not the Bureau of Prisons Alcatraz that came generations after. The basement sections surrounding the corridor were sealed off from general inmate access entirely, with no documented route connecting ordinary cellhouse life to that part of the old fort. The most likely explanation is considerably less dramatic than a secret escape route. It was probably a defensive passage built during the fort era to move ammunition, personnel, or water without stepping into open ground, later repurposed to carry plumbing or electrical conduits once the federal prison took over the building above it. Prison maintenance logs from the 1930s describe exactly this kind of retrofit elsewhere in the building, running new electrical lines through existing masonry voids rather than cutting fresh channels through the cell blocks above. Plumbing crews and electricians had every reason to use whatever solid, dry passage already existed rather than cut a new one through active cell blocks. Old fortifications get reused for exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous purpose all over the world. Practical, not conspiratorial. History rarely hands over the dramatic answer, and this time it didn't either. Less dramatic, maybe, but far more honest about what this island actually is beneath everything visitors come to see. The tunnel was never a secret escape route. It's a leftover of Alcatraz's first identity as a fort, swallowed whole by its second identity as a prison, the way an old building sometimes survives inside the frame of a newer one without anyone noticing. The military fortress era ran roughly from 1853 to the early 1930s, nearly 80 years of cannons, garrisons, and siege preparation that never came. At its peak in the 1870s, the garrison numbered close to 300 men. By the time the Army handed the island over, only a caretaker detachment remained. The federal prison era ran from 1934 to 1963, a much shorter 30-year stretch that nonetheless produced almost every story people associate with the island's name today, from Al Capone's cell to the 1962 raft escape. Put those two timelines side by side and the math is blunt. The tunnel predates the prison by more than 50 years, built for soldiers who never imagined a cell house, a dungeon, or a single federal inmate would ever rise directly on top of the fort they were standing guard in. Ferries now run tourists past the same shoreline soldiers once scanned for hostile ships, unaware they're circling a fortress twice over. Built for soldiers who never imagined any of it, and never excavated by anyone trying to prove them right until now. The National Park Service manages Alcatraz today as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, keeping the site physically intact while researchers study what's underneath it, welcoming more than 1 million visitors a year who mostly come for the cell house and the escape stories. The recreation area itself was established in 1972, when Alcatraz formally passed from federal prison surplus land into the park system. Most ride a ferry out from Pier 33, spend an afternoon inside the cell house, and ride back without ever hearing that the ground under the exercise yard has its own older history. Alcatraz City Cruises has operated as the exclusive ferry concessionaire since 2006, running boats roughly every half hour during peak season. This survey served both goals at once. It preserved the ground while revealing what lies beneath it, without a single excavation permit or a paving stone disturbed in the recreation yard. The findings show a 19th century fortress folded whole into the prison's own foundations. A building hiding inside a building for well over a century, walked over by generations of inmates, guards, and now tourists, none of whom had any real way of knowing what they were standing on. A building hiding inside a building is the whole story here, once the escape rumors are stripped away and the radar data is taken at face value. The real hidden history of Alcatraz was never the prison above ground. The version on postcards, movie posters, and the audio tour every visitor gets handed at the dock. It's the fortress mapped beneath it, and the strangest route running through that fortress doesn't lead toward freedom at all. It leads back to the island's original purpose, a soldier's passage that no inmate ever got the chance to walk. Sealed away from the population, it sat directly beneath for 3 decades. 2 identities, 1 hillside, and 1 radar survey finally pulling them apart after a century of overlap. DHE Prison Was, Built ONA, Buride Fortress. Everything under that yard. The dungeon, the magazines, the corridor running toward the old seawall was already there decades before a single prisoner set foot on the island. Radar didn't create that history. It just finally let historians read it without breaking ground, 100 years after the last person who understood the fort firsthand was gone. A century of feet crossed that yard, never knowing what stood only a few feet below the gravel. If buried history like this is the kind of thing that keeps you watching, stick around and subscribe for more.